Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on protecting your clients in a crisis. My name is Mark Weisleder, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone who's here today. All of you should be able to hear me and see the presentation. If you have any questions, just text them during the presentation, and I'll try to answer every question afterwards. Based on all the questions I've received to date, I believe that I'm able to answer all the questions during the presentation, so you may want to wait till the end to get them. Everyone who registered will get a copy of the webinar and the slide presentation. If you have any questions afterwards, you can just email me to mark@realestatelawyers.ca. So with that, we're going to get started. Many of you have taken webinars and seminars with me before. I've been doing this for a long time, but this is the first time that I've gone through something like this. I've been recently interviewed by the National Post. Other papers have interview requests that I'm supposed to do later this week. And I've also been on CTV and expect to be on more regarding this, how real estate transactions are handled during this pandemic. And I'm a senior partner with realestatelawyers.ca LLP. These are the books that I've written. This is my guide for landlords, and we'll have a lot to say about the relationship between residential landlords and tenants a little bit later in this webinar. And so first, I did want to say something about my own law firm, realestatelawyers.ca LLP, and how we are completely prepared to close every real estate deal during this crisis. Number one, we have already set up the ability to have a remote video signing conference with every buyer and seller wherever they may be in the world, literally almost 24 hours a day. And so we're able to sign someone wherever they are without physically seeing them. And they don't have to travel anywhere to sign papers. And we can close now every transaction, no matter the address, anywhere in Ontario. Many of you who've sent real estate transactions to our firm know that we pay all real estate commission by electronic funds transfer directly to the brokerage right after closing. We don't send checks. And because we don't deal with checks, we're uniquely positioned to make sure deals close on time. I don't know if many of you have been to a bank branch recently, but many branches have closed. Many are operating under reduced hours. And it's not as simple to go to a bank branch to get a bank draft for a closing. We eliminate all of that because all of our buyers are able to pay us the closing proceeds right from home using their an online bill payment, because our firm is registered as a bill payee at all the major banks. I do not know of another firm that can say that. And so we can close any purchase without the client having to go anywhere with a bank draft, and they don't even have to go to their branch with all the difficulties that is there. And because of that, we're also able to help put real estate deals together in the first place. Because let's say you're acting for a buyer and the listing brokerage does not have the ability to take a deposit through a wire or something similar, we can actually take the deposit into our trust account for the buyer through a bill payment and hold it for the buyer who we act for in the transaction, and everything can be done without a check. If you've closed a deal with our firm, you know that you're advised by email as soon as the transaction is registered. The client gets all the paperwork emailed to them automatically on the day of closing. And We used to be, I think, the only firm that found that if we just gave our sellers a lockbox, they could leave the keys in the lockbox and the buyer would not have to go pick up keys. They could just go to the home after closing. Well, now we're delighted that more and more firms are realizing this, and this is becoming almost a mandatory clause to insert in your agreement. So what is our goal? Our goal is no checks, no keys, no couriers. We want to be able to do the entire deal without seeing a client other than a video conference. And of course, we're available by telephone to answer any questions. If you have any questions about a real estate deal and want to make sure that it can get closed during these times, I'd be delighted to speak to you, or send me an email, mark@realestatelawyers.ca. So the number one question I received is, can a buyer refuse to close because of COVID-19? The answer is no. Now, it's very similar to the mini market crash in 2017. Just because a buyer cannot get financing, they can't sell their existing home, they're sick, and they can't qualify for a mortgage, or they can't even fill out a mortgage application, they have no right to cancel the agreement. Just doesn't happen that way. The only possible way would be if the land registry system or the banks were completely closed down and could not obtain title insurance to assist. And I'll say more about this later. So because the government registration system is not going down, it's being run remotely by people who work for the government, and the banks are still able to fund mortgages. Deals must close. And so what we're trying to do when buyers are having difficulty, and you should think about this too, is there a way to save the deal so it doesn't go this way? But let's say buyers cannot close. What happens? So if a buyer cannot close, they don't have the funds, well, the deposit will still stay in the listing brokerage trust account, either until the parties settle or a mutual release is signed. If there's no settlement, then the seller is allowed to resell the property and sue for the difference in price. So if the property sold for $500 and the buyer can't close, and the seller sells it to a new buyer, for example, for $50, well, they can sue the buyer for the $50,000. And we saw that in 2017, and it will be the same result today. But as a listing brokerage, you cannot release the money from the trust account until you get a letter from, or you cannot relist the property, until you get a letter from the seller lawyer confirming that the agreement has been terminated and you can now sell the property again. Now we switch to commission, and I've had a lot of questions today about this. So let's say the buyer can't close. Are you able to sue for commission if it's because of COVID-19? So the listing brokerage cannot sue for commission. If the buyer can't close, the listing brokerage gets no commission. But the interesting question is, well, can the buyer brokerage sue the buyer if they can't close and they had a signed BRA? And so the answer is that yes, the buyer brokerage could sue if they had a signed BRA, but I would warn buyer brokerages to think carefully before they do this, because if a buyer can't close and they're facing financial ruin because of all this, social media will not take kindly to realtors who still sue for commission in those circumstances. So be very careful. Now, if a buyer and seller sign the mutual release, the brokerage, if they plan on suing for commission, they shouldn't sign the mutual release, but they have to follow all the instructions. So my recommendation is brokerages should always sign the mutual release and then follow the instructions, whether the money is to be paid to the buyer or to be paid to the seller. I've seen some circumstances recently where a deposit is paid and it's conditional. But then the buyer gets cold feet, not because of the condition, just because they're afraid of the real estate market, so they refuse to waive their condition. And the seller takes the position that the buyer is not acting in good faith. And so they don't want to release the deposit. And now the deposit gets stuck and we have no agreement. And so this has happened a lot in the last little while. Now, is there a way you can avoid this? And I'm giving you a clause that I have seen already that states that if the buyer, for any reason, does not waive their conditions, then both the buyer and the seller irrevocably, that means you cannot change your mind, direct the listing brokerage to return the deposit to the buyer. And then it says without the necessity, that means without the necessity of signing any mutual release. Now, RICO has looked at this clause and they've said that if this has been explained and it's in the agreement, then the listing brokerage can follow this even if they do not receive a mutual release. But my own recommendation is you must explain this clearly to the seller so they understand this when they sign an agreement. Should parties settle or sue? I've always said for many years in all of my books that when you sue somebody, the only winners are the lawyers. And so really, you should always recommend and try to settle. I've already had situations where buyers, sellers have come to me, deals can't close, and we've tried to work something out. And in my experience, the deal on the table is usually the best deal the seller is going to get. So it's worth trying to find a solution. And I would recommend anyone who's in this situation to assist, work with the other agent, and try to help find a solution, just as the lawyers are going to work together to try to find a solution that works for everyone. So the first solution that you're going to look for is an extension. And so you're going to see if you can extend the deal on terms that are fair to everyone, because maybe that's all that's required. The buyer needs a little bit more time to maybe sell their home, get their financing ready to close. And typically, we would ask that the buyer pay an additional deposit just to show good faith for the seller to agree to the extension. You should just understand that no extension is the same. People are always in different circumstances, depending on the buyer situation and the seller. The seller may want to take a VTB to assist the buyer perhaps for a year or two at a very low interest rate to be able to come up with the money to close. There could be a reduction in the purchase price. Now, this isn't for every deal, but I've had situations where the buyer is a first-time buyer with only 5% down and they can't close. Now, the seller could sue them, but they're going to end up paying a lot of money in legal fees and they may not collect anything at the end. And so here I would recommend, maybe you consider reducing the price, at least getting the most you can and not have to pay any lawyer fees. In 2017, we had situations where many buyers had paid, a high deposit, let's say $50,000, and then they couldn't close. And so they would say to me, well, I'll give the seller the $50,000 deposit and I want a mutual release. And they were surprised when the seller said, wait a minute, I might lose $100,000 to $200,000 on a resale. Why would I settle for $50,000? And again, not every situation is the same. So in those cases, what we said was, well, why don't we just put the house on the market and see the price that we can get? And let's say a price comes in at a certain range where the loss to the buyer is less than $50,000, then the seller can accept it and take the balance from the deposit and sign a mutual release. So that would just require a little creative language, but that may be necessary. even in today's time. So these are all solutions that we're looking for because we're trying our best to save the deal, if at all possible. For many years, I've always said to people, don't buy and sell on the same day. Buy first, get bridge financing, and then close your sale. Just imagine Thursday, April 9th, the day before Good Friday. On Good Friday, the registry system will be closed. Easter Monday, the registry system will be closed. So imagine a family is buying and selling on Thursday, April the 9th. And so they will pack up the house they're selling in the morning and drive to the house they're buying. And they may get there at 1 o'clock ready to move in. And they'll call their lawyer saying, we're ready to move in. And the lawyer will say, well, I haven't closed your sale. And until I close your sale, I don't have the money to close your purchase. And if that buyer needs an extension, well, now that extension is going to go till the following Tuesday. The client who's buying and selling has nowhere to go. They can't go to the new house. They can't go to the old house. Their furniture is on a truck. And the damages could be prohibitive. And the buyer could be a first-time buyer who can't afford to pay any damages. So you see, it's always easier if you buy first, get bridge financing, and then if you close your purchase and your buyer needs an extension, well, they can just pay interest on the bridge. And it's easy to calculate the damages and move on. But I also recognize that a lot of people are downsizing. They could be seniors. So they're looking to sell and to take all the money from the sale to buy the purchase. So they don't need a mortgage. For those clients, they're not going to be able to get a bridge. So we have to do everything we can to make sure the deals close on that date. And just so you understand, the registry office today closes down at 5 p.m. But your agreement of purchase and sale says that the buyer has until 6 p.m. to complete the agreement. That's very important, because what that means is that, let's say on Thursday the 9th, the registry system closes down, but the buyer lawyer is able to wire transfer the money into the seller lawyer trust account before 6 o'clock. Then the agreement can still close in what we call escrow. So what escrow allows is the buyer can go in, live in the home, the seller can have use of the money. So let's say we're dealing with that situation where the person is buying and selling. And we've had that at our firm, where we're acting on a sale and a purchase, and the money from the sale doesn't hit our trust account until 5:45 p.m. We're still able to turn around and wire that money to the seller law firm before 6 o'clock, and both deals will close in escrow. Now, for firms that continue to send closing money by certified check, this is impossible. And it usually results in extensions having to be requested, and people, again, to be on trucks, hotels, and not be able to close. And so people have asked me, okay, let's say those two deals close on Thursday, April the 9th at 5:30. Nothing is registered on title, but we've transferred the money and we've given the keys to the buyers. So now we come back to the registry system on Tuesday, April the 15th, and we go to, or 14th, and we go to register. Oh, all of a sudden, a lien shows up on title. Now what happens? That lien wasn't there on Thursday when we checked, but now it's got registered first thing Tuesday morning. Well, the beauty is when you order a title insurance policy, you're automatically given something called gap coverage. Gap means that title insurance will protect you in case there is a gap between the closing, when money is transferred and exchanged, and registration. This is very important because it's this gap coverage which will also permit almost any deal to close, even if something happens to the government registration system in the next 2 months, which I don't expect, but will still allow to close. So when we get to the clauses that you need to put into agreements, I'll come back to this to explain. This next clause is an explanation of how our buyers can send us money through a bill payment to close their deal. And we're also sending this to show you that any deal you're working on, if the listing brokerage cannot accept the deposit, we can take it into our trust account directly from the buyer. We can represent that buyer and we can get the deal closed. Now we'll come to the clauses. Now I've seen, unfortunately, too many clauses that people have been using regarding COVID. I'm going to give you what I consider the clauses you must have, and then I'll comment on some of the others. So the first clause makes it clear. We're only going to transfer money by wire transfer. Forget about checks. There should be no checks. The second clause should permit everyone to sign the paperwork by electronic commerce. We're going to do it with video recorded conferences, and we'll then email all the papers to the other law firm. So there's no paper that has to be exchanged with anyone to sign. And then the third clause, my favorite, is getting everybody to use the lockbox solution. We don't have to meet anyone to exchange keys. They're left at the property, and the buyer gets the lockbox code when the seller lawyer gets the money by wire into their trust account. So I'm delighted about this, and we're going to make sure it works. So you can see at our firm, we don't have to see the client from the time they sign an agreement until we actually close the deal. Now, for any other clause that you're looking at, here's my principle. It's okay to extend the agreement for a period of time, but do not give anyone the right to cancel the agreement. That's the main principle you have to know. It's okay to extend. I've seen the 14-day extension clauses, but that's it. No one has the right to cancel. So this brings me to the next clause, and this is maybe the most important one because it provides that if the deal cannot close because there is a closure of the government office. So let's say the government office collapses, something happens, no one can register a deal, and it's going to be closed for 2 weeks. The deal can still close as long as title insurance is there to protect the buyer. So the example I gave you over the long Easter weekend, just stretch it out for 2 weeks. It doesn't matter. The money has changed hands. The keys have been given to the buyers, and everything will get registered once everything goes back online. So with this clause, deals can close as scheduled. And so when people say, should we add clauses now into our existing agreements to protect them? We sign deals in February. They're closing in April or May. They don't have these clauses. Should we add them? To me, these 4 clauses that I've mentioned just now, that should be put into every agreement, because that way you're making sure your deal will close. All the other clauses, you have to read very carefully before agreeing. So as an example, I have seen clauses that say if the purchase price falls by 10%, the appraisal, before closing, the buyer can cancel. You can't agree to something like that. I've seen if the lawyer office closes down, we're going to extend until the lawyer office opens. I don't agree with that. You know, if deals can close, clients should have lawyers that can close the deals. And if the law office has to close down because a key employee is sick, I understand, but that law firm should be sending the clients to lawyers who can get their deal closed. Now we have these other 14-day clauses that say something like if the buyer or seller gets quarantined and everybody's acting in good faith, then the deal will be extended not to exceed 14 days. Whether you had that clause or not, I believe that the buyer and seller lawyer would come to some kind of accommodation anyways if people are sick. But I'm okay with those clauses as long as the limit on the extension is 14 days. In other words, that's all. No right of cancellation. So for any other clause, and people have sent me these clauses, I'm happy to give you an opinion. Try to limit it. It's wires, no checks, no keys, closing with title insurance gap coverage. That will make sure your deal will close in a timely manner. I have also seen where people, because they're signing everything with DocuSign and they're not meeting people, mistakes are made when the agreements are set up. So 2 examples, the agreement is finally accepted and delivered after the irrevocable, even a half an hour, or the waiver is delivered a half an hour late. In both of those circumstances, because of the phrase time is of the essence, those agreements are terminated. So people have always asked me, well, how do we put it back together? The buyer and seller still want to do the deal. Well, one way is, well, we'll sign a mutual release, we'll get the money transferred back, and then we'll do it again. Well, getting money released is a whole new issue right now. It's going to take a lot of time. And so it would be better if you could just revive the agreement with a short amendment. So I've given it to you right here for you to use. And so you can add the agreement as a schedule to this amendment. But you see, the second clause says that the agreement failed because, for example, the condition wasn't waived in a timely manner. And then the parties want to novate, which is the legal term for bringing it back, and revive. I call that the medical term for reviving the purchase agreement. And then we just have the terms. So the parties hereby restate and novate the agreement. So the agreement is brought back on the same terms. The second clause says the conditions have all been satisfied or waived. So we deal with the problem. Then we say the new closing date is, if you have to change the closing date, and then you say all other terms stay the same and time continues to be of the essence. So with this amendment, you can now fix that agreement and move your deal to close. Now we're going to get into a bunch of other clauses, and I think these clauses have new meaning now because, frankly, buyers are going to be very limited in their ability to see a home before they sign a deal, to inspect a home, to visit a home just before closing. And so we have to think about that when we are preparing the rest of our clauses. So I've given you a fairly detailed chattel fixture clause, and I would encourage you that anything in the listing that is a feature in this home, you include in your chattel fixture clause, whether it's granite countertops, whatever they say in the listing, put it in here. And that's your way to protect your buyer so they get everything they're expecting. I understand virtual tours and everything else, but try to be as detailed as possible with this clause. Keys. A lockbox is no good if you don't have 2 complete sets of keys. So this is my condominium key clause to get every key, mailbox, garage door opener, fobs, anything you need, 2 sets, either in the lockbox or in the home on closing. And I've given another key clause to use for houses, that any interior, exterior lock, keys are available, garage openers, etc. And so make sure you include this so there's no argument about it on or after closing. Many of you are okay about putting in the rental clause, that the buyer assumes certain rentals, whether it's the hot water tank, water softener, furnace, air conditioner, whatever it is. But you also have to make sure that the buyer is going to sign any contract required by the company. And this clause is for the seller to make sure the buyer not just agrees to assume, but they sign the paperwork. Because if a buyer does not sign the paperwork, what happens lots of times is the company continues to bill the seller, and it's aggravating for everyone after closing. So put this in, figure it out, and make sure that there's no arguments over what is being assumed by the buyer. Now we come to holdbacks. And holdbacks are, as you can imagine, they are becoming more and more of an issue, because let's say the seller has to do work before closing. Now the buyer can't go inspect to see if the work is done. And now buyers can't have that final visit. And so the thought is, well, why don't we hold back some money, and we'll see after closing and if everything's okay. But you can see how difficult it is to word these things, because the buyer is going to find all kinds of problems, even problems that are not even in existence. And the seller has no way to control this. What I've done here is I've said that if there's work to be done and the buyer can't inspect it themselves, then you have to get a letter from a professional, whether it's a contractor or electrician or plumber, that the work has been done. And if you don't get the letter, then the holdback money goes to the buyer. But as you can see, this is very difficult to negotiate. And I'll give you the example about the swimming pool, where people buy in the winter. And there's no way to inspect the pool, and everybody talks about holdbacks. Well, we'll hold back $10,000, and the seller and the buyer will meet in May when the pool is open, and if anything's broken, it comes out of the holdback. That sounds good, but every seller I speak to says, well, how do I know if I close in January that the buyer didn't bust the pool in March, and now I'm paying for it? And so they don't like to agree to a holdback. And so my advice to the buyer typically is, see if you can find the person who closed the pool. If they can tell you that when the pool was closed, everything was working, or just assume that you're going to have to pay $10,000 to fix the pool and adjust your offer accordingly. So buyers are going to have to think about that they should adjust their offers if they're not getting the proper chance to do the inspection. And that's how they protect themselves. They already sort of put in a buffer where they may have to pay some money for repairs, but they're going to take it off the purchase price right away. That is a better way, in my opinion, to deal with it. I've had many calls and emails about residential landlords and tenants, and so I'm going to try to answer everything as quickly as I can. Many tenants were not able to pay the rent on April the 1st. Many have lost their job. They won't be able to pay the rent on May the 1st. And the government has already said you cannot evict anyone during these times for non-payment of rent. And even if you wanted to evict, the landlord and tenant board is closed, and it will take about 6 to 12 months for anyone to get a hearing to evict. So you see, from a practical standpoint, I understand the frustration of landlords. I get it. But bullying, yelling, screaming is not going to help, and will likely only make things worse later. So what I'm telling everyone is make a deal with the tenant, treat them with respect, try to collect as much as you can right now, and defer the rest of the rent. Don't forgive it, defer it. Will you collect it ever? I don't know. I'm hoping that the government will provide subsidies to landlords as part of this economic package, because it only makes sense that they provide for this, because they have to help landlords as well. So my view is try to be reasonable and work with the tenants to try to collect whatever you can. And I know that the landlords have mortgages. And if you're not collecting rent, you can't pay the mortgage. Well, banks are working with you too, and the government is working with the banks to work with people to maybe let them add 3 months of interest payments onto the principal, defer it to later. Everybody, frankly, has to get through this together because the board is not going to help us. And you have to understand that. People ask me about commercial leases. Commercial leases are different because they're contracts. So just so you understand, on maybe over 98% of commercial leases today in Ontario, if the rent is not paid on April 1st, the landlord has the right to go with a bailiff and lock the tenant out on April 17th. And this is why many tenants are terrified right now because of that. Will landlords do that? I don't know. I don't know who they're going to replace these tenants with today. And many large landlords are doing the same thing. They're making deals with the tenant, trying to help them along, keep them in business because they want them to have their businesses saved. And my advice to commercial landlords is not to try to take advantage of this to throw out tenants, but to work with them because you will also not be looked at too kindly if these things ever go to court. So now let's talk about selling a home occupied by a tenant. So if the lease ends and you want to sell your home, can you evict the tenant? In normal times, the answer is no. So in normal times, you know, the only way you can evict a tenant is either the landlord is moving back in or they've sold the home to a buyer who's going to move in on closing. So I've already received many inquiries. So agreements were signed in February. The proper 60-day notice was given to the tenants because the buyer is moving in. And the notice said April 30th, tenant is supposed to leave. And the closing is scheduled for the beginning of May. Sounds good. Now, in the normal world, if a tenant said, well, I'm not going, the landlord would have to go to the landlord and tenant board with the buyer to prove that the agreement was in good faith, and they would get an order that would cause the eviction of the tenant. Well, remember what I said, the board is closed. So any tenant who received that notice can just say, I'm sorry, I'm not going. I have nowhere to go. And so, too bad. And many owners are calling me and I'm saying, well, you can't force them out because you can't get an order. And so when they say, okay, how am I going to get my deal closed in May? The answer is, you're going to have to find this tenant some other place to live and pay them an incentive. That is the only way to guarantee the deal will close. And I've already negotiated a few of these for sellers in exactly this circumstance. And so people ask me, well, the tenant is causing all of these damages. Can I sue them? The answer is no, because every tenant is allowed to dispute any eviction. So you will not collect a dime from the tenant. And my advice, find an answer. You know, one of the other impacts of the virus is that the Airbnb industry has completely shut down. And so all those people who have those Airbnb units have no customers. They're looking for tenants now who will just pay them a monthly rent. So this could be a solution for some of you. If you have to move out a tenant, you can actually get a place in maybe a fairly nice building that used to be an Airbnb. So please consider that as a possibility. Showings. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about showings. I understand RICO, the province, they want everybody safe. They're saying absolutely no showings unless it's essential. And there are different rules depending on which board you're in. And to me, the key thing is safety. As I said earlier, we're able to do a deal now without physically meeting a client. We can do the entire deal that way. Now, I understand that you may have to do a showing to get the deal done. And so how could we do it? Well, you could limit it 1 to 2 people. Limit the time, maybe 20 to 30 minutes. Everybody wearing gloves, masks. I've seen all these waiver forms that people sign saying they haven't been sick, they have no symptoms, etc. I've heard of people who leave all the lights on and open the drawers so that when buyers come in, the rule is don't touch anything because everything is on and open and ready for you. Whatever works, try to do and limit so that everything remains safe. Now, the virtual meeting. You see, one of the problems with these are, how do you get a videographer into the house if the seller, is afraid, and they may not be needed. But it is possible for a seller to do a Zoom tour themselves. So in other words, they just take their laptop, just the way I am right here, and they just go room to room, show everything, and later they could do this directly with a buyer. And so the buyer could say, could you please go in the living room? Yeah, I'm in the living room. I have a couch that's 8 feet long. Could you go to the wall over there and get a measuring tape? Could you measure it and show me the measurement? And the seller says, here's the measurement, it's 10 feet. And the buyer says, okay, I understand. So you see, it is possible to go through the entire house this way between buyer and seller to give the buyer a little bit of comfort. Now we come to pre-listing inspections. So many sellers used to do this, when the market was very strong, where they would have a home inspector come in and do an inspection and give it to the buyer. Now, the problem with those home inspections was that they couldn't be transferred to the buyer. They were just there for the buyer to look at. To me, it is possible today to have an inspection done that could be given to the buyer with the permission of the home inspector that would actually be something the buyer could call the inspector, ask questions, and rely on. And I know there are some home inspectors that are not doing this, but there are others that are. And in addition, my firm has found through one of the title insurance companies that we use, FCT, that they are offering a after-sale home warranty for every buyer up to 18 months. And it will be for $20,000, and it will cover the roof, the foundation, the heating and cooling system of the home. And so they may also be packaging it with a home inspection as well. And I'm told that the cost for the warranty is $349 plus HST. And if you add the home inspection, it comes to $749. And you can go to the website fct.ca and you could check it out, ask questions. But I believe that if a seller was able to provide something like this to a buyer, it takes away some of the risk in having to buy a property without being able to do the due diligence that you may want to do. I do want to say that my firm, Lawyers.ca, we get no money from these warranty programs or anything else. We're just trying to find ways to help you to get your deals done even through these difficult times. However, I still would recommend that if your buyer wants to purchase without any kind of inspection at all, and they say, okay, we'll just use the video tour, you may still want to get them to sign the AREA Form 127, which says you explain to them the risks, but they still decided to go ahead with the purchase anyways. Now let's talk about FINTRAC. And you heard earlier how we are signing all of our buyers and sellers without meeting them. And these rules were approved by the Law Society for all lawyers in Ontario. So long as we can verify the ID in a video chat, we can sign people up through DocuSign or other types of signatures, and it's completely acceptable. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what you should do as well. Now, some lawyers are still having clients come to the office where they may use a big boardroom and they put the papers on one side. The client sits on one side, the lawyer sits on the other side, and they explain the papers, and the client signs, and then the lawyer witnesses. But again, you're trying to avoid any kind of personal contact. And so let's say you were doing something similar with a prospect and you wanted to do their ID, then you might maybe think of the same thing where you meet them in a boardroom, they put their ID right on the table, you go and take a picture and fill everything in later. That's possible. However, why should you take any chances? As far as I'm concerned, have the client first send you in advance picture ID. Then have a video call with them and you record that call. Just like I'm recording this webinar, you record that call, have them show their ID right to the camera so you can verify it's the same thing you're holding, and then keep a copy of the recorded webinar. And to me, that will satisfy any FINTRAC auditor, especially during these very difficult times. And so that's my recommendation, strong. And it's backed up by the fact that lawyers are now able to do the same thing when they're identifying buyers or sellers. Now we come to the law of disclosure. And again, this is related to the fact that if a buyer has the right to inspect and check, they can't complain too much if the seller doesn't tell them everything. But now we're in a world where buyers may have to buy and they're not able to inspect. And so do the principles of disclosure change? Well, just to give you the general principles, if it's a defect that you could see if you were in the home yourself, then the seller doesn't have to disclose. The only thing a seller has to disclose is it's something that even if you were in the house with a home inspector, you wouldn't be able to see. And this would be foundation problems, major leaks, mold behind the walls. So you see, what about the crack in the counter underneath the toaster oven? Well, if you don't ask the seller to lift the toaster oven, then they can say too bad about the crack. And that's why these virtual tours may not be enough for you to check everything. But there's another legal principle as well. And what it means is the seller cannot intentionally conceal any defect. And so if the seller has intentionally concealed something, so it's completely not available in the virtual tour, and the seller knows this is all the buyer can see, I think a case could be made after closing for the buyer to go after the seller for misleading them on the transaction. And so that's something that still could be done today. I will say a few things about psychological defects. Murders or suicides, the law is the same. This does not have to be disclosed by a seller. And what I've said to many people, if you want to protect a buyer, Google the property address, because sometimes things will come up on the internet, or insert this clause, and many of you already do that, where the seller has to say that as far as they know, during their ownership, there's never been a murder, suicide, or anything else on the property. So with that, that brings me to the end of my formal presentation of the webinar. And so what I'd like to do now is if you want to make some comments, whether you found this helpful, please, I would like to answer, or if you have any questions, please ask me and I'll take a few minutes to answer right now. If you have any other questions, please send me an email afterwards. So first of all, thank you very much for these comments that are coming in. I appreciate it. If I don't get to all the questions, I promise you, you can email me to mark@realestatelawyers.ca and I'll be able to answer them, and I will send you all, if you've registered, a copy of the presentation as well. So thank you so much. But before I go, I did want to say to everyone that on behalf of all my partners and the staff at Lawyers.ca, I just want to wish all of you and your families good health and stay safe in everything that you do. So with that, I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone. Please send me an email and I'll be sending the presentation out to everyone. So thank you very much, everybody.